Hey, what's up everybody? 8-Bit Flashback here. Today I'll be reviewing the Powkiddy X18S, which is capable of playing all kinds of retro video game systems, such as Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, PlayStation, Sega Genesis, Sega Saturn, and much more. Here are some of the features for the X18S. It has a 5.5-inch IPS screen with 720 by 1280 resolution. For the CPU, it's running a T618, which can reach speeds up to 2 GHz. For the memory, it has 4 GB of RAM and 64 GB of storage, plus a micro SD card slot for memory expansion up to 512 GB. This also features Wi-Fi and Bluetooth connectivity, vibration feedback, a 5000 mAh rechargeable battery, and a 5-point touchscreen. And for the operating system, it's using Android 11. As far as the way this looks, I like it. It kind of resembles the Nintendo 3DS and has a color scheme that resembles the Super Famicom. And here's a cool feature with this device. When you close it, it automatically goes to sleep. And when you open it back up, it starts right back where you left off. And the screen hinge clicks into place in 2 positions to offer different viewing angles. For the controls on the bottom of this handheld, it features 2 analog thumb sticks, a D-pad, A, B, X, and Y buttons, and start and select. And it also has a few system control buttons for volume, power, home, and more. Then located on the top is an additional 4 shoulder buttons, a USB-C charging and communication port, a mini HDMI port, and a micro SD card slot. The controls all seem to work well, but the D-pad and action buttons are a little bit smaller than I'd like them to be, and the analog sticks have somewhat of an awkward placement. But after playing this handheld for a while, I was able to get used to all the controls. This handheld does feature stereo sound with some fairly decent quality, but the quality may vary depending on what emulator you are using. And here's a quick sample of what the audio sounds like. And since this handheld does feature an IPS screen, it can be viewed clearly from a variety of angles. So the X18S is an upgrade to the X18, which looks to be the same, but the new model has a faster processor for a wider range of emulation. As far as the menu goes, it's fairly plain and there's not much pre-installed, but since this is Android based, you can download apps and games with ease. Although there is no Play Store pre-installed, so you have to use the Chrome browser to download an alternate Play Store such as AppToad to download apps. But I did just recently read that they updated the software on this device, which now includes the Play Store, but I have not had a chance to test it out. Okay, let's test out some emulation now, and I will start off with the Sega Saturn using the Yaba Sanshiro emulator, and first game up is going to be Mortal Kombat Trilogy. Sega Saturn is one of the harder consoles to emulate, so anytime I can get Saturn games running on a handheld such as this, I find it to be impressive. This game seems to be playing at full speed with no noticeable issues, except for this weird noise right towards the end of this round. Next up is Sega Rally. Now this is one of the more CPU demanding games, meaning it's harder to emulate, but the X18S does a fairly decent job of handling this game. But I did have to set the resolution to original to get it to play somewhat smoothly and playable, but it's still definitely far from being perfect emulation. Next up is Virtua Fighter 2, which plays rather well. But I did notice some of the graphics flickering at times, but this was mainly just the text. The next Sega Saturn game is Off-World Interceptor, which does not emulate well at all. When selecting items and the round you want to play, there's numerous graphics that are invisible, and once you start the round, it glitches out like crazy. And here is the last Sega Saturn game I'll be testing, Bug 2, which plays rather well, but some of the cutscene animations had trouble playing and the loading times were fairly long. But overall, the emulation for Sega Saturn on the X18S is decent, and there's a few games that will play it very close to full speed frames per second. Now let's try out some other systems using RetroArch with various emulator cores. Now neither RetroArch or Yaba Centuro were pre-installed on this device. Both of these apps were downloaded through the Chrome browser. The initial setup of RetroArch is kind of a pain, but after it's up and running, it works rather well. Here is Contra 3 for Super Nintendo using the SNES 9X emulator. So the X18S can handle Super Nintendo emulation with pretty much no issues. Now let's try out the Game Boy Advance using the VBA Next emulator, playing Tekken Advance. So I tried a handful of Game Boy Advance games, and they all seem to play pretty good. Now let's test out some Nintendo 64 using the Mupen 64 Plus Next emulator, and the first game up is Goldeneye. So the emulation for this game is okay, but it does have auto frame skip enabled, which becomes noticeable at times because the controls feel somewhat jerky and the visuals look somewhat choppy at times. And here is Hydro Thunder for the Nintendo 64, and this game seems to be playing smooth and at close to full speed. The only issue I was having with this game was the controls. It looks like the trigger button needs to be remapped to a different location, which can be done inside the RetroArch menu. And here's another Nintendo 64 game, Cruising USA, which unfortunately does not play well. Okay, let's test one more Nintendo 64 game, This is Gex 3, which seems to be playing pretty smooth, but has a few issues with the video cutscenes. The overall emulation for Nintendo 64 on the X18S, I would say, is good enough to enjoy some of your favorite games, but still far from perfect. Now let's test a few Sega Genesis games using the Pico Drive emulator. So I tested a decent amount of Sega Genesis games, and they all played great. And now let's try one more Genesis game. Here is Sonic 2. Now let's test out one last system. This is PlayStation using the Beetle emulator playing Spider-Man. So I'm not the biggest fan of the Beetle emulator, but that being said, it still seemed to play the PlayStation games rather well. There is a few other options out there for PlayStation emulators, such as PSX Rearmed, which should offer better performance, but I've not had a chance to test that out yet. Spider-Man seemed to play great most of the time, but there was a few video cutscenes that would get choppy at times when using the Beetle emulator. But I'm pretty confident a different emulator would resolve this issue because the X18S is more than powerful enough to handle PlayStation emulation. Now let's test out one more PlayStation game. This is Skull Monkeys, which plays really smooth, but for some reason it seems really dark. Almost like the brightness on the screen needs to be raised. But again, I think a different emulator would resolve this issue. So here's my overall thoughts with the X18S. I really like the faster CPU on this device, which is capable of handling a ton of retro gaming emulation, and the Android operating system, along with the touchscreen, make this handheld very easy to use after setting up the initial applications. As far as the build quality goes with this handheld, I would say it's decent or average for a device such as this, and I would prefer the D-pad and A, B, X, and Y buttons to be slightly bigger, but I was able to get used to that after playing for just a short while. And as far as the looks go, I like it. It's kind of a cross between an Alienware laptop and a Nintendo 3DS. So for anyone out there that is interested in picking up an X18S, a link will be down below in the description. Okay, it's now time for me to go. If you liked this video, if you could, hit that like button, and please subscribe. And have yourself a great day, and I'll see you next time.